The primary purpose of this podcast is to educate and inform. The views, information, or opinions expressed by hosts or guests are their own. Neither the show nor any of its content should be construed as investment advice or as a recommendation to buy or sell any particular security. Security-specific information shared on this podcast should not be relied upon as a basis for your own investment decisions. Be sure to do your own research. The podcast hosts and participants may have a position in the securities mentioned personally through sub-accounts and/or through separate funds and may change their holdings at any time.
Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of This Week in Intelligent Investing. Great to have you with us again, and great to welcome a special guest, Samir Patel, the founder. He runs Askeladden Capital. I've known Samir for a long time, really respect his investing and his writing. He's done a lot of work on AI in value investing, and that's what we want to focus on today. I think we're going to learn a lot. I'm really excited for the conversation. Samir, welcome to you, and welcome to my co-host, Elliot Turner, as well.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Elliot. It's great to be here. Pleasure to be speaking with you, and thanks so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts with your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. So, maybe you can tell us how you're thinking about this, some of the highlights of what you found, and we'll take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it might help if I just really briefly explained how this all got started. So, I think as value investors, we all try to be reflective and think about our mistakes, right? And so one of the biggest mistakes I think I've made in my career is with regards to COVID. And, it's a tendency of value investors. I think Lisa Rapuano talked about this with regards to the global financial crisis many years ago, that often you can be so focused on the micro, right? And we have this habit of being like, okay, the macro is not really affecting us. We're focused on our own companies, their situations. But then every so often, there's this sort of event at a macro level that's so important that it can overwhelm those micro factors. And so I think, one of the lessons I learned from COVID is, there's no plan for your business when revenue goes to zero, right? It doesn't matter how good your business is. If your business is shut down, that's not something you really plan for. And so during COVID, basically the only important analytical issue became for many companies, when will COVID end? Does the company have the balance sheet to get through that, et cetera? And, frankly, we were slow to respond in those early days when if we'd spent a little bit more time on it, we might have realized, okay, we own some great businesses, but they are going to face disruption from COVID. And maybe instead of reflexively doubling down on price weakness, we should actually be selling, focusing on other businesses. So with AI, that's kind of how I came to AI, where I hadn't really paid too much attention to AI before probably late 2024, start of 2025. And like many people, I think when that first Blender bot or whatever it was called from Facebook Meta came out, I played with it. I had a fun time with it. I showed my mom, my wife. I'm like, hey, look, this thing can write a decent high school compare and contrast essay. Like, that's kind of fun that you just tell a chatbot to write me something on, War and Peace or whatever it might be. And there you go. You get this essay. But obviously, over the past few years, we start to see AI, particularly with GPT 3.5 and some of the subsequent model releases becoming more and more capable. And so I realized at some point, it makes sense to step back from my everyday looking at bottom-up fundamentals of value investments and to spend some time just thinking about AI, right? Because, this was kind of when there was a lot of hype and maximalism, which there still is. But I just wanted to investigate in sort of a dispassionate way, a number of questions. One is, how is this going to affect my companies first and foremost? And then the second is, how am I going to use this in my business? And so that's where a lot of this came from. I spent a lot of time on it. I think there's a lot of surface level analysis. And I think particularly once you get deeper into using some of the different tools, particularly if you're using it through APIs, where you have more of an ability to customize and deal with, for example, the hallucinations and some of those things, it gave me, I think, a really broad view of not just how it's going to affect our companies, but also I became increasingly convinced of its potential to really help us from a value investing standpoint. And I know that's been a topic of some discussion recently. Guy Spear publishing the article, asking, is value investing dead? And I kind of come out on the other side of that, where I think this is one of the greatest things to happen to value investing in a long time. Happy to get into it. I'll kind of stop there and let you guide where you'd like to go.
Yeah, that's a fascinating introduction. And I think, I'd urge everyone to read Samir's Q4 2024 letter, which is a really deep dive into the way you're using AI right now. And I'd imagine there's some evolution since then, but I've always been intrigued by this notion I've seen it called Kasparov's principle or Kasparov's law, that like a human with a machine is better than merely a great machine. And so maybe to start, like when you think about using AI, you're talking about using it, not it replacing certain key functions. So like how do you make sure one of the things that when I look at AI, there's just so much information, there's so much data, there's so much we could do with it. So how do you filter out the vastness of it and get specific and focused?
Yeah, I think those are great questions. So I think let's start with your Kasparov question, which I think is fascinating. And John knows that I'm a big fan of mental models. I think I've given a couple talks over the years at conferences and things like that. And so I think about AI through that lens of mental models. And so you think about, let's start with one, for example, trait adaptivity, right? And so it's this idea, popularized by a lot of people as you don't judge an elephant by its ability to climb a tree, right? Different people, different machines have different traits that makes them better, more or less suited for certain things. And so I recently read a book called The NVIDIA Way by Tae Kim, which is a little bit about the history of NVIDIA. And one of the analogies that jumped out to me is this idea of CPUs versus GPUs, right? So for a long time, CPUs dominated workloads because they kind of think a little bit more like humans, sequentially, logically. AI is built on GPUs, as we all know by now, right? NVIDIA, and it's massively parallel. So when you think about investing, what AI is not able to do, what that GPU is not able to do is sort of that reasoning. And I think we're all aware of this, that even the reasoning models don't really reason causally or from first principles or from truth the way that a human might, right? They're essentially very advanced pattern matching engines that can sometimes mimic reasoning in many ways, but they don't reason. And so that's how I fundamentally think about the divergence. The counterfactual or the corollary to that is humans are very, very slow, right? So if I want to read a 10K or a proxy looking for some basic information, say, how has management been compensated in this business over the span of 10 years? How has the company's guidance compared to the actual results, and where has that differed, right, over a long span of time? To read that sequentially as a human would take a long time. AI doesn't read sequentially. AI sort of reads massively and in parallel. So I think the opportunity, as you discussed, as I mentioned in my letter, really marries human judgment, right? Which I don't think that the AI currently has the ability to replicate. I don't see the path to it getting there, at least based on LLMs, but using AI for some of that sort of mass data processing. And we've always had the ability to do that with spreadsheets, with tools for the quantitative data. But what's a lot more interesting sometimes is to be able to go through things like conference call transcripts and things like that and extract the insights and the information much faster than a human would be able to do. And then that leaves more time for you to spend your own judgment.
Yeah, so maybe talk about that a little more, right? You now have more time to spend on human judgment. So like what does that mean? What have been the biggest shifts in your time allocation and cognitive energy now that you've had like over a year working with AI in this way? Are you turning over more rocks, turning over your portfolio more? Like what does it mean?
Yeah, so I think the portfolio turnover is obviously a little bit more dependent on market conditions. As far as the research side of it, I think what it does is two things. So I like to talk about, and I think there's always another mental model is this idea of trade-offs or opportunity cost, right? I think there's always a little bit of this concern that I hear when I talk to other people about like, well, okay, if I don't do the work myself, am I going to miss something? Right. And I think that's a little bit of a red herring where, for example, there's lots of kinds of analysis you can do on a company, but most of us don't have the time if we run reasonably diversified portfolios to do all of that exhaustive analysis on every single company, right? There's always going to be some additional proxy or 10K or some additional detail industry report that you could look into. And so where I have seen the biggest application is I think of if I can just step back, I think of my research process almost in three phases. So the first step is simply orientation, right? The first step is you come into a new business, you come into a new industry, you don't know any of the jargon, you don't know any of the history, and you're just trying to get a lay of the land, right? It's like if someone drops you off in a new country you've never been in before. You don't know the language, you don't know the customs, you don't know the culture. Your first step is just simply trying to get, some sort of high level overview, right? And what I used to find is that oftentimes when I was doing my research, I'd be reviewing the same document, whether that was a 10K, a transcript, whatever it might be, a news piece, 2 or 3 times. The first pass was simply, like I said, that orientation of trying to figure out what is this company? What do they do? What are the very basics? The second step is then once you have that, trying to develop some sort of more detailed understanding. It's like, okay, I understand at a very high level. Now let me dig in on the key issues. And then the final piece is sort of that due diligence piece, right? Of like, okay, there's certain issues that it's very important that I know the exact details, the exact numbers. I really dig on in on these issues. And so I would say that AI is probably decreasingly applicable with a caveat in those three buckets, right? So it's amazing for that first pass. So I'll just give you an idea. There was one company that was a peer to a company that we've invested in. I was interested in them, had seen them for a while, saw the stock go down on earnings, and I said, you know what? Let me dig in. And very quickly, it would have taken me previously 2 or 3 days to get to this point, but within 3 or 4 hours using AI, I'd figured out, okay, there's enough red flags in this business that it kills it for me, right? I can just move on to the next idea. And you guys know how valuable that is as a portfolio manager or as an analyst, where, not spending 2 or 3 or 4 days or a week on an idea that's not a good fit for you allows you to go and spend that time on something else. So what I would say is that AI is enabling me both to get to kind of the meat faster, right? To get through that first step and to really get to, okay, what are the core issues? Then, of course, there's data extraction. There's, being able to go back farther in time with some of those things I talked about, like looking at many years of data as opposed to a few years of data, because you just simply can't read 10 or 15 years worth of 10Ks or proxies, right? It's just difficult to have the time to do that. And I think the final piece of it is then you start thinking about, well, what if I don't have to spend so much time reviewing securities filings, what are sources of information such as expert calls, things like that, human interaction, talking to other shareholders, more time spent with management or the board of the company to learn from a different angle that the AI can't replicate, right? Because the AI just simply doesn't have access to that data. So where I've been where what's been interesting is initially I thought, okay, this is going to allow me to get done, 5 or 10 times as many companies. I think what I'm finding is that could be true, but I'm choosing to reinvest a significant portion of it in depth and understanding, whether it's existing portfolio companies or a new company that I'm getting into, doing a bit more exhaustive work, including, again, having more time for expert calls, having more time for sort of the human scuttlebutt type of research as opposed to just the desktop research.
Yeah, maybe let's pick this apart like in some of the pieces. That
Sure.
early learning curve on a given company. Talk about the tools that you use. Like, have you automated processes to kind of tap into AI and build that initial impression on a company, or do you approach each project kind of as a discrete project?
Yeah, it's a mixture, and I've played around with a number of different approaches. I'm very fascinated by AI automation to the extent that my wife's actually launched an AI automation business. That's a whole separate topic. So I do use many AI automations. As far as researching companies, no, not really. I don't have I do have a prompt library of standard prompts that I use. But one of the things with automation is obviously it takes time to build the automation. And then you kind of have to decide, okay, is that worth it? And then, of course, there's going to be more of a uh, one size fits all output, whereas the way that I like to learn about companies is a bit more interactive, right? Like I might ask one question, but then you want a follow up question on that same topic, or you see something of interest, and then you go to that specific source material. And it's a back and forth between sort of the AI generated portion and the actual source material. One thing that I think is very important is using the right tool for the right application. And so with AI, obviously, one of the large problems is hallucinations, right? As I mentioned, it doesn't reason causally. And in many cases, it can either get things wrong, it can misinterpret things, which is one set of problems, or it can simply make things up. So initially, we tried using ChatGPT or Gemini or the public LLMs, and we found, or even, by the way, things inside of like AlphaSense, right? And we found that what's better is if you take the securities filings, you put them in something like Notebook LM, which largely doesn't hallucinate. It can misinterpret things, but it doesn't really make things up. and having that ability whenever there's a statement to immediately directly click to the source and review the source material, which I find very important, right? Because obviously, and we're not even talking about getting to like, okay, the numbers you put in your model in terms of, the cash versus the debt, but just even that understanding, a lot of times if there's something interesting, you want to be able to click through and dive deep on that topic. And so it's really interesting because there's all these tools I have built, but just something like Notebook LM, I think, gets you a lot of the way there in terms of being able to query. And it becomes, to your point about the Kasparov, and chess and everything, it becomes more about asking the right questions, right? Which is one of the reasons it's a little difficult to automate, because for any given company, the right question isn't going to be the same. And the right question for the company might not even be the same at different points in that same company's evolution, again, depending on what the current issues are that's important from a valuation perspective.
Yeah, that's super interesting. You raised a lot of material that I'm fascinated by right now. When I got your letters from John, I was in the middle of this book, Co-Intelligence by Ethan Mollick, and he talks basically the entire book is about how and why we should start using AI as early as possible, because the more you use it, the better you'll be at it. And this notion that, how you ask the question will determine a lot of what sort of value you're able to take out of the AI that you're using. And he also talks about hallucinations, and he says that hallucinations are actually kind of interesting. Everyone's focused on the risks of hallucinations, but if you know that AIs hallucinate and you understand why they hallucinate, you could actually use that to your advantage, i.e., when you're looking to pursue something creative, when you're doing the steps that involve brainstorming, when you're doing things that are far more open ended in nature rather than kind of specific and closed ended, then hallucinations are actually to your advantage. And you can find creative material that you can't actually create yourself. I thought that was fascinating. And then Notebook LM is like, it's guardrails around the material you're working with. It's a very specific set of material. So, like you mentioned, doing more expert calls with some of that free time, or at least going deeper in some companies. One of the things I started doing was creating these Notebook LM folders on industry verticals or sub industry verticals or companies. And I've now done like, I don't know, hundreds, thousands of expert calls, and I've started organizing them by topic and then kind of scraping, asking questions of it, like what's evolved, what's changed, what holes might I want to learn more about, what other experts should I seek. Curious, I'd love to hear more of like some of the specific tools into the weeds of where you're taking this. Do you have a preferred model when you're getting started early on? Like how yeah, talk me through some of the process.
Yeah, it's almost hard to structure, right? Because there's so many different directions you can go. I think for a moment, I'll just start by sticking with the idea of picking the right tool for the job. And, again, back to mental models, Charlie Munger, you think about man with the hammer, the gallbladder surgeon, whatever analogy you want to use. And I think, again, to your point, that creativity, to the idea of trait adaptivity, the creativity or the hallucinations can be good or bad. And so that's why originally, I tried using ChatGPT deep research, to try and see what that would be. I found I was spending so much time fact checking or wading through inaccurate information that I largely don't do that anymore, except for very specific things. Where I think it actually can be helpful, and I got this idea from my friend Gary Silverring, Gary Machuris, is this idea of using it as a devil's advocate, right? To your point, leveraging that creativity of, okay, well, here's all of my research that is validated, is from good source materials. What could I be missing? Right. And then you have this sort of very sophisticated pattern matching engine that can go out and might find some angle that you haven't thought of. Right. And then you go through it quickly. And as opposed to like when you're researching a company that you don't know and you don't know what is and isn't true, you're like, okay, I understand this issue. Don't have to worry about that. Don't have to worry about that. Oh, maybe this is something I need to look into further that isn't covered in my research or that isn't covered in my analysis. So I think that's very powerful. To your point about Notebook LM and the ways it can be used, I do also think, there's a lot of, and I think a lot of organizations are looking at this, but there's a lot of data or there's a lot of things written down and the ability to go through that, just as an example, when I was building some of these automations and I wanted to figure out, okay, what kinds of businesses work well for us when I built the letter screening tool. I built the rubric for that largely by asking Notebook LM to look over our old letters and our old write-ups and say what makes a business that Askeladden wants to invest in, right? And of course, you and I could name many of the factors off the top of our head where it's like recurring revenue, things like that. But being able to do that without forgetting or without having to go through all of this, even being able to go through when you've written down notes on a company from years and years ago, or in the case of like my website, being able to go through all these book reviews I've written, all these mental models I've put together, and just being able to query against that internal knowledge base to refresh your memory on something that you may have forgotten. Where I don't know if you have this, but I all the time I'm like, oh, there was this statistic I saw somewhere, or I know in one of my research documents I talked about this phenomenon, but I have hundreds of these things. I don't know where it is or where to find it. And it's amazing to be able to very quickly get back into that mind space. So I'll stop there. And I think you wanted to go deeper into maybe specific tools or applications.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that there's so many different models, right? And by the way, just knowing Gary at least a little bit, it's so not surprising that he used devil's advocate as his best example. Yeah, totally resonates. Like, do you think you get different output from one model versus another? Do you feel that when you ask questions, that perhaps you might be leading AI to an answer for you just with how you ask questions? So how do you avoid doing that? And are there kind of like structured series of like fail safes that you have to review the output to make sure that yes, even in you use Notebook LM for certain things where you don't wanna risk hallucinations, but when you're using something else, might you like, how do you make sure that you're not dealing with the hallucination of an answer rather than a high quality, like, impactful piece of
Right.
information?
Right. And I mean, my answer is largely I don't. Right. And that's why, so if you think about any process that you're implementing, you always have to think about the counterfactual. You always have to think about A/B testing. So, just as an example, one thing I will do is if there's a company I know very, very well, like let's say it's a portfolio company, there's a little bit of this, actually I'll back up. There's a little bit of this Dunning-Kruger effect, right? And one of my mental models is this idea of product versus packaging, where if you see someone in a nice suit and they sound well educated, you're more likely to take them seriously, right? As opposed to if someone dresses like I do on a daily basis, right, in a ratty old t-shirt from 10 years ago. So that's the thing about AI is it's the proverbial person in the suit because it always gives you a very polished, sophisticated, grammatically correct, well-structured output. But I've had instances to what you mentioned where I'll ask it to generate, a report or what have you on a company that I know very well and, be able to then actually benchmark, okay, what is it getting right? What is it getting wrong? What's kind of the error rate? And that's why, like I mentioned, I no longer use LLMs or even largely, things like what are embedded in AlphaSense to do research, right? It may be helpful more for finding sources. I think that's one of the really helpful things. I like to call it automating Google, where whether it's Perplexity, whether it's Chat GPT, being able to query in natural language and find, again, another mental model base rates, right? So you think about like, okay, what is, I was recently researching a British travel company. What are historical statistics on the percentage of people who book travel this way versus that? Right. And trying to find those statistics yourself on Google, like, all of us as value investors have done that sort of thing. It just takes a lot of time, right? Finding the right source, learning, thinking about how to translate what you have in your head into a keyword, sorting through a bunch of sources versus using AI. You can very quickly surface high quality sources and then review those yourself, right? But the AI is sort of automating that Googling process for you. And to your point about creativity and hallucinations, it might come up with 10 or 50 or even 100 search terms that I might have not thought to for that same idea. So, no, I think my answer is that I would not use public LLMs for serious research. Now, if you were building a workflow and you were to use a RAG type system or you were to be able to use the API and turn the temperature down, that's a different thing. By the way, random aside, I don't know why ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, and all these don't have like a built-in temperature dial that you can use in the consumer app because you can do that via the API. But it's really frustrating to me that sometimes, like you said, sometimes I want to query and I might want the wackiest off the wall answer. Think about like, okay, here's an ingredient in my pantry. I want to make something new for dinner. right? What are some cool things I could do? Like right now, I've got a lot of basil growing in my garden. It's, I got to use it up before the first freeze. Give me lots of ideas for what I can do with basil. Well, their hallucinations are great, right? You need some real creativity, versus you want a factual answer to a question. You don't want it to be hallucinating. So that's why I personally tend to use Notebook LM or those types of systems where you don't have that risk of hallucination. And then, like you said, you also, I do think it's still very important, at least I find, to review the source material yourself. It's just helpful to, if you think about it, I think of it as like control F on steroids, right? This ability to like, okay, if I want to learn about how has a company's margin evolved, right? You can get the very quick high level summary of all the initiatives that have impacted margin, the reasons it's gone up, down, sideways over the past 2 quarters, 2 years, 2 decades, whatever time frame you want to look at. But then it's citing right there, Notebook LM, all of those source documents, and you can go see, okay, on this transcript 3 years ago, here's exactly what they said. And even with a highly reliable tool like Notebook LM, make sure that it's not misinterpreting, because particularly with spoken material, it can still confuse. If the person didn't speak in a grammatically perfect way, it's not smart, right? It's just doing pattern matching. And so it may generate some sort of unusual outputs that you look at yourself, you're like, oh, this is what the person was trying to say. It's very clear to me, but the machine didn't understand that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It makes a lot of sense. I love that citation feature in Notebook LM because you know
Yeah.
exactly what it's talking about. And it is helpful for like data mining and figuring out where things that might have some imperfect recall in your brain, you don't exactly remember where it comes from, and you can very specifically drill it down once everything's sorted nicely in Notebook LM.
Right. And sorry, just to answer your other question that you asked about, which model, and I think, honestly, all of them are pretty good. It really comes down to personality, and then there's just some sort of workflow things of like, at one point, my wife and I were using ChatGPT, subscriptions to ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, and Gemini. And at some point, it just becomes too much, right? Because you kind of want your information consolidated in one place. And I'm always going to have Gemini because of Notebook LM, but also because I use Gmail. And so naturally, as part of the Google ecosystem, you have that. I do have a ChatGPT Pro subscription. And then there's Perplexity, where, just a small example, I think a lot of people don't really know how to use ChatGPT versus Perplexity yet, where because Perplexity does the real-time web search for those things I was talking about, like find statistics, so on, and it returning sources, Perplexity is often much better for those sorts of things versus if you want to write code, you want to, like we discussed, play devil's advocate, something like that. ChatGPT is more helpful. So I've been using GPT-5 a lot. I really like it. I do use Gemini for something. But I would also say that I'm very, I forgot about Grok. I used to use Grok a lot more, and then that's kind of fallen off. But I would say that it's just one of those leapfrog things where it seems like every time, whoever's released the latest model seems to be the latest and greatest, and you switch over to that. And then I'm sure, very excited to try out Gemini 3 that's supposed to come out in a few weeks. And I'm sure I'll find use cases for that. But I think it just boils down to personality. And as an example, one thing I seem to use Gemini for a lot is summarizing my internal research. Writing my investor letters used to take me a huge amount of time because I have all this research, but obviously you're not gonna deliver your LPs a 50-page document full of internal notes on every company in your portfolio, right? So taking what I've written internally and just shrinking that into something that I can present to LPs and say, hey, here's how this investment did this quarter, why we like it, what we don't like. And that's something I use Gemini for extensively because I find that Gemini just seems to be a little better than ChatGPT. That same task of, writing the summary that kind of meets the criteria that I think should be in there with less editing needed from my side.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think for the listeners out there, it's important to just take note that it doesn't really matter all that much which AI you use, right? It's all about how good you are at structuring your questions and how curious you are. And I think that's something that all investors could appreciate. That's what we're here for at the end of the day, right? Asking the right questions and looking in the right places. One of the use cases I thought was really interesting that you'd pointed out was looking for opportunities. You'd pointed out something about like analog semiconductor industry where like AI will drive these third and fourth order impacts. Like that to me taps into this idea of creativity using AI where it's fairly open ended and you talked about making connections where they might not have been obvious. So like beyond traditional screening, like how do you use AI to identify these non-obvious investment opportunities and maybe are there any like major light bulb moments you've had in these kinds of like thematic high level queries?
Yeah, that one's interesting. I mean, so the what you're referencing, that's actually that came from an expert transcript where, and it was a funny analogy, but the expert basically said something to the effect of, well, if your refrigerator is going to be AI powered and order you milk when you run out of milk, it's going to need a sensor to determine when the milk has run out. And so, therefore, that's just an example of as you think about AI translating to the physical world, inference being not just something we're doing through an LLM, but something that's being done by, whether it's factory automation, whether it's robots, whether it's, whatever it may be, those are all going to require mechanical components. And so yeah, looking at the second order impact is interesting. I mean, I would say, I've been a little bit disappointed by that, and I'd certainly love to hear from you or from any listeners if I'm missing something. But I have tried asking AI those kinds of questions, and I feel like AI is sort of very good at delivering almost consensus, right? Because its training data is sort of the whole corpus of human knowledge. If you're doing web search, it's the stuff that's already out there. And so I know that there are people who are talking about, oh, Chat GPT made this scientific discovery, or it solved this, it diagnosed my illness, or things like that. And there may be areas where that's possible. But if you think about, sort of like the Peter Thiel model of the world, right? Your 0 to 1 versus your 1 to n. I feel like the AI is very, very good at the 1 to n, where if something is already out there and there's some pattern out there that matches what you're putting into it, it can return that to you. In terms of that true, and that's creative in a sense, but that's also more just like knowing what's out there. In terms of the true, 0 to 1 coming up with a new idea, so far I haven't really found a way to use AI for screening other than, again, that stuff you're talking about where you're looking for a qualitative factor that you might previously not have been able to identify, but you kind of have to already have the documents or have to already be asking the right question. So, is there room to do that? I've played around with tools. I know people who've been building that. I know people who've been working on that. I personally haven't found a good way to do that yet, except for, like I mentioned in my letter, taking other people's investor letters that are public, putting those into AI through an automated workflow, and having it screen for ideas that match the kinds of businesses that we want to invest in. But no, in terms of the true creativity, haven't seen success there quite yet.
Yeah, I don't have good anecdotes myself either. Still pretty early in this journey, and I think not enough time has really played out to see if anything truly stands out. But I experiment with it and tinker. You'd mentioned reading the NVIDIA Way, and I thought it was very interesting. I've been very involved in life sciences, researching companies, making some investments to my detriment thus far in some ways, but some wins, some losses, more frustrations than anything else. And I thought it was very interesting at the very end of the book. Jensen is kind of asked, where does this all go next? And he's like, our most profound impact is going to be in the life sciences, biotech, drug discovery, and whatnot. So I've started this big project that I used AI to get started in asking creative questions on where I should look, and have now done dozens of expert calls, which inevitably will lead me to writing a white paper on this and maybe a couple investment ideas. I'm not sure if they are investment ideas yet, but they're ideas. So that's interesting. And I've learned a lot. I've learned that, NVIDIA is way more verticalized in the life science space than they are in any other area. Like BioNemo is literally one of the more profound models. So they're a model builder. They're like an open AI, but they're also
Right.
helping companies build better instruments and make their tools better, and using a layer of AI in cell analysis that formerly had not been possible before because GPUs are being added to each instrument in certain areas. Like kind of going into more depth than necessary in something like this, but I think it's interesting. It started with the book, it then went to AI, and has been in many tangible places in my mind and in my efforts of late. So I think,
Right.
you know, TBD overall, but I do think that's interesting.
It is, and there's so many. I mean, there's so much. The thing is, like when we say AI, you have to be careful because, like, when I say I usually mean an LLM, and that's what most people usually mean. But of course, when you think about protein folding or the things Google's working on, there are, of course, many other applications of, AI or machine learning outside of LLMs, which I think you're referring to, some of them.
Absolutely, but it's actually both is one of the interesting things I've learned, because people are building these like multimodal agentic models that are semantic in nature. So someone who formerly was a bench scientist really good at analyzing cells can now have the power of a statistician in their hands and could get those insights with language rather than numbers. And so, there are all these different areas. There are protein language models, which I never had heard that phrase before, a PLM instead of an LLM. And yeah, I think it's kind of the tip of the iceberg. And I think one of the interesting takeaways is that a lot of people don't really know where it's going. Kind of like in investing, but you start getting specific ideas. I wanted you to share one of your stories that I found fascinating from the letters, which was, I loved the phrase, the first AI powered proxy contest. Tell us about this because that was awesome. That was really interesting.
Yeah. So that's definitely interesting. So I'll give you the real brief version, which is, we're not professional activists, but we're willing to stand up for our client interests when need be. And at one of our portfolio companies, AstroNova, we were, not satisfied with how results were trending. In particular, they'd made kind of this disastrous acquisition that had just gone from bad to worse, was losing lots of money, and they didn't seem to be kind of taking real concrete steps to address that. And so we engaged in, we tried to talk to the board, and I won't get into all the details because all that's public. But long story short, our presentation to ISS, which that deck is very important, we largely built it using AI, right? I forget the name of the specific tool, but there was some slide creation tool that we used. I think there's a couple of them. We tried a few different ones and settled on one. And then the images, even in the images in the deck, were generated by ChatGPT or Gemini, and just having high quality images. I mean, just as an example, there was one slide where we talked about the differences between the culture of the business in the U.S. and the culture of this business in Portugal that they purchased, and there was this really funny image we generated of these very happy Portuguese people doing business in a much more relaxed way, sitting on the beach and looking at reports, as opposed to people in New York kind of staring at reports at midnight in a skyscraper. So yeah, so that was interesting. And there's people out there who would have charged us $50, $100, $200,000 to put together that ISS deck, and using AI, we were able to do it in a week or two at much lower cost, basically free, other than my own labor. And of course, even the inputs to that, right? Like when we're gathering all this data, being able to use Notebook LM to go back, like I said, 10 years of proxies. And okay, here's, one of the things we mentioned, for example, is, what are the STIP targets, and how has management performed relative to the board's own targets? And, why hasn't a change been made if these targets are consistently being missed? But being able to go back and pull all that data very quickly. So, that's an interesting kind of example of, look, I'm a one-man shop. I don't have an army of analysts. We do have, 95 million in AUM, whatever it may be today based on the market, but we don't have infinite resources. And so being able to use AI kind of as this, I talk about it as a force multiplier, right? And I think it's particularly interesting for smaller funds, where if you're trying to be capacity constrained and go after a specific strategy like we are in the microcap space, but then being able to use AI as this kind of what I call this army of infinite interns, where you then, are able to level the playing field a little bit versus a $500 million fund or a $5 billion fund that can just throw a bunch of junior analysts at the problem, right? If you want to learn about something, you want to learn about an industry, you tell the junior analysts, hey, go out and get me all this information. And of course, a junior analyst isn't always going to get it right. They're not always going to have the judgment or insight. That's where the senior analyst or the PM or the head of research comes in. But I think that's how you can really think about AI, is like, if I had an infinite army of reasonably competent interns or first or second year analysts, what would I have them do? And kind of had it do that, right? With that same idea of course, you're never going to take, I mean, even if I get an idea from another principal that I really respect, a fund manager who I really respect, I'm not just going to go blindly buy that idea, right? I'm not just going to say, oh, they think this stock is cheap. This person tweeted about it. They wrote it up on Vic. They wrote it up in their letter. Let me go, put money into it. No, of course, you go do your own research. You verify what they said. You think about it independently. You et cetera, et cetera. But it's still helpful to have that starting point, and that's what AI can really be. So yeah, so the proxy contest was just an interesting example of the, and unfortunately for me, my business is pretty simple, so I don't have the need to do this a lot. But then you think about a lot of businesses and just how much time people spend in meetings or dealing with email or preparing invoices or et cetera, and the extent to which AI workflow automation can handle a lot of that, right? And take it away from the human plate and allow you to focus on what you best is another aspect. So the proxy contest was a really interesting. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else has done that yet, but it's fascinating to think about how that could make, for example, not that I hopefully have to do this again soon, but how it could make small cap activism easier and cheaper by taking out some of those steps and being able to generate some of that content that you previously would have had to hire a PR firm or someone to do.
Yeah, I mean, let me ask you this. Would you have done that were it not for AI and what you knew you could do with AI?
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be giving me a little bit too much credit in terms of planning, and again, not to get too deep, but I think when we started, we didn't necessarily, a lot of proxy contests or a lot of these things get resolved early. And we were originally just trying to have a conversation with the company, and that's not how it worked out. And we ended up having to kind of take it almost all the way to a vote. So, I don't want to like have this foresight that how everything was going to be, but it certainly, I mean, let me put it this way: with the resources that we had available to us, I think our efforts would have been a lot lower quality were it not for the ability to generate a lot of this stuff using AI, do a lot of the analysis using AI. And going back to the point about expert calls, one of the things we did that I think a lot of other shareholders really respected, we did almost like, I think, 30 expert calls. I'd have to look, it was like somewhere between 25 and 35 conversations we had with people in the industry who knew that business and that industry very well. And we presented a lot of that material, but just being able to do those calls, again, if I'd been having to make that slideshow myself, right? And of course, it's not like I just looked at the AI slide and said, this is good enough. It's just having that framework to start, right? Having the formatting laid out and the images. And it's like, okay, I'm going to change all the text. I'm going to make it 4 bullets instead of 3, or 2 bullets instead of 3, or by, whatever it may be. But having that starting point was tremendously helpful and allowed us to spend, time and resources elsewhere.
Yeah, I get the sloppiness of the journey, but I think it's an interesting point to consider that were it not for AI, running a firm by yourself, you now had a tool at your disposal that was pretty valuable as a manager in getting a good outcome.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, as a first time activist, we got endorsement from ISS for 2 of our 5 candidates. Glass Lewis endorsed all 5, which is, not very common. And I attribute a lot of that to, again, being able to, if it wasn't for, we wouldn't have had such high quality material to put out there if it wasn't for AI, at least not with our resources. Or we would have had to decide whether it was worth spending, extra hundreds of thousands of dollars, which, I'm not made of money. So that would have been quite the decision.
So, a lot of AI conversation is very high level. I like that we've been specific, but one of the things that I really like that you did in your letter was talk about a very specific goal. And that goal was increasing your watch list to 150 names and
Sure.
then inevitably 250 names. So I'm curious where you are in that journey. Are you finding that an achievable goal or is it a moving target? And, how do you feel about the depth, breadth, and quality of increasing the number of names in your coverage area?
Absolutely. So maybe just for the benefit of readers who didn't read that, or listeners who didn't read that letter, or who haven't read about our strategy in general, we've always tried to build this watch list, which is certainly not unique to us, right? But the idea is that rather than always going and looking for ad hoc ideas, just having this list of companies that you know well, that you like, that you think have a good future, and then just waiting for whatever combination of circumstances or market sentiment to take the valuation to a level that you're comfortable paying to initiate a position. And so we've always done that. And I think just the challenge is, as a one man shop, if you're trying to keep up with your existing portfolio, I mean, you've caught me during earnings season, right? I've had, I don't know how many companies, 7 reported in the last handful of days. And then you're also trying to handle your trading, like with all the carnage in the market today. And you're also trying to handle new ideas. We would put names on our watch list, but then what would happen is there's names that, so for example, like JLL and CBRE, the real estate brokers, we'd research those in quite some depth in 2017, never come back to them. Right. And so we have them on our watch list and we have a price, but who knows since then how many acquisitions or dispositions they may have made, what may have changed in the competitive landscape. Maybe they are now dominating the industry. Maybe some new competitors have come in, who knows? And so that name may have been on our watch list historically, but it wasn't really very useful because it's, the information's way out of date. So I think there's a couple different ways where AI helps. And our goal is to not only increase the number of companies on our watch list through the research process we've been talking about, but also then the ability of AI to do a very quick update where if you have your thesis written out, right? So say that you have your research on any company, we'll just go with CBRE or JLL, right? And we've identified what we like about the business model, what we don't like about the business model. And then you just put that thesis into, say, a notebook LM, along with the transcripts and the earnings reports and things since that period, the 10K, whatever interesting information there may be. And then you basically ask, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? What elements of what has changed? What hasn't? And it allows you to do this sort of qualitative update where, again, it's not just all about, one of the things we found that we would miss on our watch list is because we were only monitoring the price. We'd see the companies whose stocks go down a lot, but a lot of times if a stock goes down a lot, that's because where there's a smoke, there's a fire, right? There is market sentiment issues, but there's also, hey, there may be this company struggling. What we would often miss is what can sometimes be even more interesting, which is maybe this company's business is getting way better, but the market's just not recognizing it yet, right? For whatever reason. But we just wouldn't see those because, again, it is very mechanical in terms of we basically only review it if the price went down to a certain level. So I think that AI's ability to kind of do that qualitative work, and again, it's not like you're going to make an investment decision off that, but if I want to know, like, hey, here's this company I looked at 10 years ago, what's new with this company? Is their business more or less still the same, or has something interesting happened? Again, kind of getting that quick report, here's what was validated, here's what's invalidated. Also, just by the way, getting that feedback, which is enormously helpful as an investor, because if you think about like Philip Tetlock and super forecasting, right, one of the ways to be a good forecaster is to actually evaluate, how did your forecast do? Why was it right? Why was it wrong? And so going back to that idea of internal data, there's all this research I may have done years ago, and I may have said, okay, I think this company has a great competitive position. And maybe I look at it 10 years later and that business is completely eroded, right? Well, that says that there was something missing about my analysis at that time that I didn't capture, right? And that tells me something, even if I never invest in that company, that's useful information for the future. So with regards to the specific target, that's absolutely still our goal. I mean, I think, like I mentioned, we've been investing a lot of time in depth versus breadth, right? So I think, as with any KPI, you don't want to get overly, you think about the mental model of incentives, right? So if I just wanted to put companies on the watch list, what I would do is I would find a bunch of companies that are really easy to research, that are not complicated, regardless of whether or not they're businesses we like, regardless of whether or not they're, the kinds of businesses that will ever trade at a valuation that we find reasonable. And you just go ahead and run research on them and learn about the business and put it on your watch list. But obviously, there's plenty of cases in the past where we put a business on our watch list and eventually decided, the quality of this is marginal, or there's just too much debt, or et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's almost equally valuable in terms of killing, like I mentioned with that idea earlier, where there was a company we researched and it did end up on our watch list, but we basically decided, look, unless they change this, or unless they fix this technology platform that they've built through all these acquisitions that hasn't been integrated, we've seen this play out badly too many times. We're not walking into a company that needs 3 years to fix all its technologies, right? So we were able to get there in 4 hours, and then that allows us to spend time on something. So I think it's up to every investor, where they choose to reinvest that time and what they find valuable in their own process. But that's kind of what we've been doing. So the watch list is absolutely a target, but I'm trying not to be too, recently we've been focused a lot more on depth than breadth, right? There may be other market conditions or other times where we're focused more on breadth, but I also don't want to say, okay, well, I'm not going to spend a week on this really interesting business just because I could go spend another 4 days on 4 other businesses, but we're less likely to invest in those at this time. So
maybe I'll just share a few. Sorry to jump in, Elliot. Did you want to continue?
I wanted to ask one more question that went off that, if you don't mind.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, are you relatedly increasing the number of positions in your portfolio? Because if you increase the top of your funnel, might the bottom of the funnel similarly grow?
yes, absolutely. And that's an evolution we've been on for a while. And so originally we were very, very concentrated. We're still concentrated, but we've gone from, a target of 10 to 15 stocks to, more like 15 to more like now 20 is our target. And of course, that's not a hard and fast number. Maybe sometimes it's 22, maybe sometimes it's 17, but 20 is kind of a good midpoint of the range. And that was driven both by, again, just some of the idiosyncratic volatility in the world we've experienced, whether it be COVID, inflation, but some of these macro things where you can have a really good micro thesis, but then there's a change in the world from a regulatory perspective, a pandemic, whatever it might be that you don't anticipate, and just realizing over time, that there's probably more than just 5, 10 really good ideas out there. But then to your point, there's also just this mathematical analysis of, if I own 15 stocks today. And that's from, if you think about just your selection bias, right? Like how many companies were we really working on before? Was it 50? Was it 100 per year in whatever level of depth? And so we're picking the 10 or 15 best out of that list. But now if we can work on 150, 200, 300, whatever that number is, these are fake numbers, by the way, right? Just for mental math. But and you could get really deep into like, okay, what's your hit rate, or et cetera, et cetera. But if you assume some sort of normal-ish distribution of ideas, if you look at twice as many ideas, even if the incremental idea you look at is half as likely to be good, like you should come up with ideas that are better than your existing ideas, or at least as good, which to your point would suggest that yes, you can achieve some of those benefits of diversification without giving up the upside, because you're actually just finding other ideas that are just as good or better than the ideas you already own. So trying to become more diversified, and also trying to, it just gives you the other secondary benefit is it just gives you a broader insight into, again, we all do some of this where, okay, even if we don't invest in a sector, you may read some of the earnings transcripts or some of the research from these bellwethers, right? Just to know what's going on with the economy or what's going on with kind of the broader space. And so I think also just covering a broader universe gives you more of those insights naturally that may help with elsewhere in the portfolio.
Yeah, maybe I'll share just a few ways that I found AI helpful. So one is helping you to analyze financial statements. So if I notice that something might be off in financial statements of a company, I can say how does this actually work together? And often I'll learn some intricate details of accounting that'll explain it. And sometimes it'll also tell me, well, that's kind of a red flag. So if you have kind of specific questions about financial statements, Gemini, for example, with deep research can go in and analyze financial statements of a company through time or whatever you're interested in. And I found that quite helpful. You also learn as you do it and might uncover some, red flags that maybe you wouldn't really know whether they're serious or not. Another thing that I found helpful is just sort of the learning, kind of the evergreen component. Let's say I want to, you know, learn about how did Carl Icahn invest in Netflix back in the day. You can basically have Gemini give you the whole case study, take you back in time, tell you where Netflix was trading, kind of set it all up for you the way you want to consume that kind of a case study and maybe learn something from that. So I think it's great for, case studies or learning from other investors that for whom there isn't a book out there or, something existing. You can sort of almost create your own personalized booklet on any topic that you want. And then one other thing that I found really helpful is I listen to a lot of audiobooks or just audio in general. There's an app called 11 Labs Reader where you can upload any PDF and it'll do a really good job just reading it to you as an audio. So that's also very helpful just from a process standpoint. If you spend a lot of time in the car or working out or what have you, you can actually have documents read to you quite well.
Why do you like that app specifically, John?
Well, I'm familiar with 11 Labs. They have a really good sound studio, like an audio studio where you can actually generate audio in all kinds of different voices. I mean, it's really advanced AI. And so the Reader app that they have is free. And it does the best job from what I found in terms of, just reading it in a very human-like way.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's something I've been looking at more as well, because just not even from like a productivity standpoint, but more from a like just health and general wellness standpoint. I spend way too much of my life behind a computer screen, which I'm sure, I'm sure that you all do as well. It's a peril of when your job is to read documents all day long. But that's one of the ideas that I've been trying to work on a little bit more, where it's like, okay, if I have materials to review, but can I use Notebook LM to turn it into a podcast, and then I can do some yoga, or I can, do a workout, or I can just go for a walk, but I can be listening to and consuming that information in kind of a slightly different format. So I haven't heard of 11 Labs or tried it out, but I'll have to check that out. Thanks so much for the recommendation.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd mention is in Gemini, you can create these gems, right, which are basically like templates that I found very helpful if you do some task repetitively within your process, you can use gems within Gemini to basically create and then over time refine that part of the process, that prompt, if you will. I found it really, really helpful.
Yeah, I use a lot of Gemini gems. I think you can do the same thing. My wife's written about it with ChatGPT project instructions. And I think that's like a nice halfway between building a full automation, which takes time and is a little more inflexible versus, at the same time, if you find yourself copying and pasting the same prompt all the time, super helpful to be able to just kind of save it and reuse it. I actually did that for couple things. I mean, one is like my summarizing, like I talked about, my investment letters, summarizing my research for investment letters. A second is even just like when I was putting my website back up, which I did recently, like refactoring the HTML to remove like references to broken plugins and, all things like that. But basically for each web page, there was kind of a standard process that needed to go through. And so just saving a prompt that says, hey, here's some HTML, do X, Y, and Z to it in Gemini, and then it would. So yeah, those are super helpful.
Yeah, and maybe one that I kind of figured out wasn't really helping a lot, which is, Perplexity has this Comet browser, and it can tie into your Gmail and draft responses to incoming emails.
You got to be
And
careful about the security with that.
yeah, exactly. That's one concern. I mean, that's where I'd wish that Chrome and Google would have it, because they already have my Gmail. So I'd rather it all stay with Google, because they can steal my information already. But let's put that to the side. What I found was I'd end up with all these draft emails in my drafts folder, and it would create like additional stress, because I'd feel like I need to now go through all those drafts, and if I don't go through them, and a lot of them are for emails that don't really need a response at all, and so it wasn't really the kind of time saver that I was hoping it would be. And actually, Gmail offers something where it's gonna, you can, on a case by case basis, you can ask it to draft an email. You can it has a chat window where you can tell it what to say, and it'll say it for you, and then you can approve it before you send the email. So I found that more helpful, actually.
So it's really funny. I'm glad I'm not alone. It's funny you mentioned that, because one of the most surprising or counterintuitive things that's happened since I adopted AI, and I can't remember if I wrote about this in my letter or just on my website, but my wife basically had to stage an intervention for me, because you think a lot of people think about, oh well, okay, if AI can write 80% of code or 70% of code or whatever the fake statistic is, are there going to be 80% less software developers? And I've always kind of thought, well, I think you're just going to create 5 times as much software in the same amount of time, or using the same amount of resources. And we could go into like the Berkshire textile mills and sort of the economic rationale for that. But just on a personal level, there was this idea that I had initially, where I was like, oh, well, with AI, if I get X amount of research done, then I can actually free up time. But it's almost this paradoxical, like, before, let's say I eat dinner and then I have an hour or two of productive hours left in the day. And I might say, you know what, I'm not really going to be able to make that much progress. I might be able to go through one expert transcript, or I might be able to go through, this specific portion of the business, but I'm just going to leave it for tomorrow. Versus now, it's like you could complete half a research project, in an hour or two. And so there's this behavioral or this psychological pressure of like, well, if I just sit down on my computer for another 30 minutes, I could hash out this entire issue. So paradoxically, AI was supposed to make me less stressed and save me time. And I think I've just reinvested all of that into more work, kind of like your email draft. Because now, before you're like, well, I can't answer these emails anyway, so who cares? And now you're like, well, but there's 70 pre-written drafts waiting for me. So
Yeah.
Different kind of
I
Jevons
empathize.
paradox.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Well, all of this is evolving so quickly. I'm also with you, Samir, on your point of basically having subscribed and tested all of the different LLMs, and then found that, hey, you don't really need all of them. I I'm basically using Gemini now because the MOI email is also on Gmail and so forth. And I guess I trust Google a bit more than I trust some of the others. So that does come in because it's scary how much data these LLMs kind of accumulate over time on us. And especially if you give them hooks into different systems, it's really a ton. So yeah, I guess that's that. We've learned a lot. Any parting words or anything else, Elliot, you want to mention?
Well, I just want to pat ourselves on the back because we had an investment conversation about AI without asking if AI is a bubble or we should be buying NVIDIA stock. So, I don't know. That seems unique in the podcasting landscape nowadays. I think maybe one closing theme that I was looking to ask you about, Samir, though, is getting tangible with AI investments. And it doesn't have to be a very extended piece, but you have this firm rule, do not bet against AI. Are you making any specific changes to your investing? Are you betting on AI in any specific way other than through process development? Anything on that might be an interesting way to close this investing podcast on AI.
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. And I'm of course in this very unique position where I'm very bullish on AI as a tool, right? But then you look at the markets and you look at this bifurcation or divergence between it seems like all of our value stocks or anything that's not related to AI that no one cares about or is ever going to care about, and then anything tangentially related to AI is trading at a massive valuation. I mean, I think if you think about it through a value investing framework, right, I think you're always looking for sort of these hidden beneficiaries or the second order impacts, to your point, the point we talked about earlier about the refrigerator and the milk sensor. So, just a couple ideas. I mean, one is, thinking about, okay, what does inference enable? Right. And ironically, if these companies don't get a return on CapEx, that might actually be better because then if they put all this money into CapEx, they have to use it, inference gets cheaper and cheaper. Doesn't really matter if the vendors are making money, right? But what businesses benefit from using it? Whether it's businesses that kind of have proprietary data, like we've just been talking about, where you're able to then go and do things, whether it's being able to assist with when you just think about you're building a website or you're putting up an eBay listing and all of a sudden now AI takes a lot of friction out of that. So I think those are interesting to work through. I haven't really spent a lot of time the NVIDIAs and so forth of the world, just because, again, as a value investor, I think it's a little hard. With a small microcap mandate, I certainly don't think I necessarily have an edge versus the people who are spending a lot of time on that, a lot smarter than me, access to a lot of resources than me. So I'm trying to focus on, hey, what are these second and third order beneficiaries that may not be evident now, but as AI continues to propagate throughout the world over the next 3 to 5 years, it's going to be a tailwind for other parts of the economy as well. Even though right now it's mostly concentrated in these large AI vendors specifically.
Great. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Samir, Elliot, thank you so much. We learned a lot today. I hope the listeners enjoyed it as well. Really appreciate you taking the time, Samir, to come on and share what you've learned with all of us. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity and also the recommendations. I mean, I'm always interested in talking to other people. It's not like I have a monopoly on good ideas. So loved hearing how you're using AI slightly different from me. And hopefully if any listeners have good ideas, they'll share those with us as well.
Take care, everybody. Talk soon.
Thank you for listening to This Week in Intelligent Investing, brought to you exclusively by MOI Global, the research-driven membership organization. Learn more at moiglobal.com.